Hey guys, Buildzoid here, and we're back with the Gigabyte Z790 Aorus Elite AX and 13600K and another DDR5 overclock, but instead of the Hynix A-die memory that, I was using in the previous video, we're using Hynix M-die memory, also a single rank configuration. So the setup is, of course, the Gigabyte Z790 Aorus Elite AX provided by Gigabyte, the i5-13600K provided by Intel, and the Corsair Vengeance DDR5-6200 CL36 engineering sample kit provided by Corsair. And the memory kit, as I mentioned, is single rank Hynix M-die 16 gigabit, so 16 gig sticks. And yeah, so that's the system specs. Let's take a look at the actual setup that I managed to get here. So for stability testing, I've run yCruncher VST for over 3,000 seconds, yCruncher Mixed for over 5,000 seconds, LinPack for, I believe, 44, LinPack Extreme for 44 loops. That all passed. HCI mem test to 700%, also 0 errors there. And then test mem 5 Anta Extreme 1, Anta 77 Extreme 1 for 4 cycles, and that also passed without any errors. Now, the settings that we're looking at here are 6400 CL30 with 1T command rate. And the reason I went with this configuration rather than something clocked higher is because 6600 is doable with Hynix M-die in a single rank configuration, but only with 2T command rate. And anything higher than that doesn't do yCruncher VST. I don't know if it passes anything else, but it definitely doesn't do yCruncher VST. And so I very quickly gave up on, I tried 6600. I think that gets like 3 or 4 loops before it errors out. I tried 6800. That's just no-go whatsoever. That's like 1 or 2 loops before it fails. And so basically with 2T command rate, you're still stuck at just like 6600 megabits per second at best. And the thing is, 6600 with 2T command rate actually has like significantly worse memory latency than 6400 with 1T command rate. Also because all the timing, like the thing is, when you go from 2T to 1T command rate, you can sort of think of it like shaving off two ticks off of basically all of your timings at the same time. Kinda. Not like, it's not exactly like that, but it kinda does that. And so the thing is, 1T command rate is significantly more, 6600 2T is just kinda worse than 6400 1T. So yeah, like, it's really noticeable in the latency test, but even like the read and write and copy tests actually aren't significantly slower with the 1T setup than on the 2T setup, because like 2T just wastes a lot more clock cycles. And so, even though we're clocked like, 10% lower, it doesn't really translate into, actually, it's not even 10%. It's like, what's the difference? It's like 200 megahertz. That's like 3%. Yeah, we're clocked like 3% lower. And so the 1T command rate and just kind of offsets the penalty of the slightly lower clock speed. So yeah, also, as you can see, I forgot to mention hardware info. We don't have any errors captured. And yeah, also the CPU's at 5.5 gigahertz all-core. I know right now it's reading out 5.6, but that's because you're forced to use an AVX offset with, well, I think Asus has a workaround for this. But on Gigabyte motherboards, basically, you have to have a -1 AVX offset if you want to overclock the CPU past its like single core turbo, something like that. Basically, if you try to set a 0 AVX offset, the CPU gets, like, the 13600K will get stuck at like 5 gigahertz off the top of my head for AVX workloads, and if you try to do the same with a 13900K, that gets stuck at like 5.6. So yeah, it's a really, really annoying thing that's been, like, it's a thing since 12th gen Intel. Like, the 12900K gets stuck at 5.1 if you try to use a 0 AVX offset. So, yeah, I don't know why it's a thing. It is a thing. So we're like, I don't consider this a 5.6 gigahertz all-core. Then again, admittedly, 12th and 13th 10th gen, the AVX offset isn't as stupid as it was on earlier Intel CPUs. So like it doesn't trigger in say Cinebench R20 because Cinebench R20 isn't that heavy. Like yes, it does use AVX instructions, but it's really not that heavy. So it doesn't downclock for all AVX2 workloads. It only downclocks when you hit something really hard like LinPack. So like LinPack, when it's just shuffling the data into the memory, it'll be running at 5.6, and then when the actual workload hits, it'll drop down to 5.5. So that's a lot less bad than it used to be, where like if you took like a 10th gen CPU and you had a -1 AVX offset, it would just be permanently locked at 5.5 as soon as you started LinPack. So yeah. Anyway, also, if you're wondering how this overclock performs in LinPack, it's about 506 gigaflops with, 5.5 gigahertz on the CPU. And the reason I'm highlighting this specific part right here and why the gigaflops are significantly higher here than everywhere else in this LinPack run is because hardware info was open. I decided to close hardware info for a bit so that we'd get like some like LinPack didn't have to fight with a monitoring utility for CPU time. And then I reopened hardware info because I did actually want to like monitor the CPU temperatures. And like the really cool thing with I guess especially the 13600K is like, because if you disable the E-cores, it's just 6 P-cores. It's really not very difficult to cool this thing, right? Like it maxed out at 92 degrees Celsius. And I'm just using a 240 millimeter AIO here. So like really not an amazing, some crazy cooling setup, regular thermal paste. And yeah, it does 5.5 all-core for LinPack, Y-Cruncher, other Y-Cruncher. So yeah. Anyway, so that's the setup. Stability-wise, very dailyable. I am a bit upset about the memory speed, but then again, like, this is still better than what I'd expect a Z690 board to do with a 12th gen CPU with Hynix MDI. And the performance is good. So, yeah, I'm not sure. Well, the thing is, like, I need to, because I did test MDI on the Z790 Master, and the thing is, there I wasn't using like a large loop of Y-Cruncher VST for stability testing, so I don't actually know if that setup was comparable in stability to this. But on the Z790 Master, 7,000 megabits per second seemingly works, so there does still seem to be a rather large gap in terms of max memory speed between like, 6-layer daisy chain boards and 8-layer daisy chain boards, at least for Gigabyte. Though I might have to do more testing on that because, yeah, I didn't verify the Z790 Master setup with VST because at the time I hadn't noticed what a massive, I didn't notice how hard it is to pass VST in terms of memory settings at the time. So, yeah, that only came to my attention when I was messing with the 7200 setup on the Hynix 8i sticks with the Z790 Elite here. So, yeah. Anyway, let's take a look at the BIOS settings, because this was actually kind of annoyingly difficult to set up. Yeah. It's not as bad as it wasn't quite... The thing is, I did set this up off of the basis of the 7200 settings. So, like, there's a few things, yeah, like, basically I took the ADI out, like, I dropped the clocks, I took the ADI memory sticks out, I put the MDI memory sticks in, and that was it, basically, in terms of sort of the transition from setting up the ADI to setting up this MDI configuration. And the one sort of issue with that is that I'm not sure if certain settings are actually necessary for this setup compared to the ADI setup, because I'm just reusing them because they work. So, anyway, I guess, yeah, I have the ring ratio at 4.8. And then if we look here, I have basically all of the, like, power management and throttling stuff disabled. Unfortunately, I do have to have the AVX offset on 1, because if you set it to 0, the CPU gets stuck at, like, 5 gigahertz, which is really dumb. And I'm not aware, there is a workaround for this. If you just set the CPU ratio to 50 and then just use BCLK to overclock instead of the AVX offset, that works. But, yeah, it's like it makes life a lot more difficult. So anyway, for a CPU V-core, we're at 1.43 volts. This is actually necessary for the CPU to do 5.5 gigahertz stable. I tried 1.41 volts, and it didn't like that. It's not actually a very high load voltage because the load line calibration is all the way down at low. I still haven't taken oscilloscope measurements of this board, so I don't know if like medium LLC does a decent job of voltage regulation, but low LLC is pretty much guaranteed to be good because historically it like on most Gigabyte motherboards, low LLC doesn't suck horribly, whereas on some motherboards even like medium or high LLC can be good, but generally like there are some boards where even like medium and high are a bit too aggressive on the load line, and so yeah, if I don't have measurements, I'll just go with a really droopy load line instead of instead of just mashing more voltage into the CPU for no reason. Anyway, the PLLs are still the same as what I used for the Hynix A-die setup. This is the part I'm not sure about because, yeah, I don't know if this is still necessary at just 6400 megabits per second, but it doesn't hurt anything. So, yeah, I'm not really fussed about, like, doing more work for no extra benefit, because none of these voltages is high enough to harm the CPU in the long term, and they don't harm the stability, so, whereas trying to lower them might cause instability, so at this point, I'd just rather leave them alone. So, yeah, anyway, so that's what the PLLs are at. I have VCC in at 2 volts, which that's just default for any time I'm doing DDR5 overclocking with Intel CPUs. VCCSA at 1.35, which for 6400 is actually quite high, but again, like, it works, so why change it, right? Like, it's not so high that, like, it's not going to harm the CPU, and it's stable. So lowering this voltage, like, yeah, you might slightly reduce your power consumption of the system agent, but the system agent doesn't really pull any power in the first place, so that isn't really worth the effort, in my opinion. And then we get to the DRAM voltages, where we're at VDDQ 1.4 volts and VDD2 VDDQ CPU at 1.4 and VDD2 CPU at 1.4. The board really doesn't seem to like it when you go higher on the memory voltages. I might need to do more testing on that, but like historically with these MDI sticks, I've used as much as like 1.55 volts even in order to push lower primary timings. Doesn't seem to work on this board. Like, I do believe I was messing around with some settings at like 1.55 volts, and it was just a nightmare to stabilize. If I remember correctly, I couldn't even get 6400 to work at 1.55 volts, so the board really doesn't seem to appreciate high voltages for some reason. And so instead, we've got VDD at 1.45 volts. The VDD voltage primarily affects your memory timings. It doesn't really affect max memory speed, though. Like, if you set it too high, it does cause instability. So it's like raising VDD can generally let you lower your memory timings. And it shouldn't help you run, and it generally won't help you increase memory clock. And it can cause memory instability if you raise it too high. But yeah, I might still need to do more testing on that, but that is something I was sort of noticing with this board, because like when I actually first started working on the settings for this board, I was really thinking of just replicating the settings that I had on the Z790 Master with this memory kit, and those settings were at like 1.55 volts, and it just didn't work at all, like whatsoever. So, yeah, so this board seems to be kind of limited to these lower voltages. VDDQ is at 1.4 volts. This is perfectly safe for the memory. I guess I should have mentioned that I do have a fan sitting on the RAM, because at one point I was planning to run it at 1.55 volts, and then the fan becomes sort of necessary. However, it is worth noting that Hynix DDR5 runs lower timing, can do lower timings the colder it is. So even at even at 1.45 volts, if you can keep the sticks cooler, they will do better in terms of timings potentially. Like, it also depends how temperature sensitive your specific sticks are, but yeah, it is worth noting that I do have a fan on these, so if you tried to replicate these settings without a fan, potentially in a like high ambient temperature environment, like say inside a case, with a 4090. You might find that these settings do not work because probably the primary timings will be too low relative to the voltage and the operating temperature of the memory sticks. Anyway, VPP is at 1.8 volts because, well, that's default voltage for VPP. I don't actually know why I have it set. I could have just left it on auto. It wouldn't have made a difference because VPP by default is 1.8 volts. Anyway, so that's the memory voltages. And yeah, that really seems to be the main thing I've noticed with pushing. Actually, even the A-die overclock kind of did the same thing, where I think, yeah, the A-die, if I remember correctly, I had everything at 1.4 volts for memory. Because higher memory voltages were also just, like, I can't remember if they were actually actively harming stability, but they definitely didn't help. So, yeah, this board really doesn't seem to tolerate high memory voltage currently on the F3F BIOS, which I'm using right now. I'm not sure that I actually want to do more testing on this because I find it really boring. Like, on one hand, it would be good to know for sure if the board actually has, like, issues with high memory voltage. On the other hand, I don't really care. Because, like, the main thing, if you shove more VDD voltage into your memory sticks and VDDQ voltage, if you're stuck at 6400 megabits per second, which we seem to be with this setup, the only thing that is really going to happen is like your primary timings. Like let's say instead of 1.45 volts, we were at 1.55 volts. Instead of 6400 CL30, we could maybe do 6400 CL28. And that doesn't really make much of a difference to performance because cast latency just doesn't matter that much. So yeah, So, you know, in like a competitive overclocking scenario, yeah, the voltage tolerance on this board doesn't seem to be particularly amazing, but for a daily setup, I literally do not care because 2 ticks of cast latency is, like, 2 ticks of cast latency makes such a small performance difference that it's actually a pain to measure with benchmarks reliably. So that should give you some idea of just how irrelevant that is to actually, like, boosting system performance. So anyway, let's take a look at the timings. I guess I should mention I do have fast boot disabled. If you're tuning your memory, you should disable fast boot for at least the duration of the process that you're doing your tuning. After that, you can set it back to auto. That way the system won't retrain the memory every time you reboot, though for some memory setups, you might actually want to have fast boot permanently disabled. Because potentially, like, skipping the memory training might lead to you getting into Windows with settings that aren't stable. Also, I do have round-trip latency training enabled. This helps memory latency a little bit. It's worth noting that on some CPUs, turning on the round-trip latency training will cause massive instability because the memory controller sucks. This is especially common on 12th gen CPUs in my experience, but yeah, like, I imagine even on 13th gen CPUs, you could run into scenarios where, you know, you turn on round-trip latency and you just don't have any stability anymore. But if you can turn it on, it does give you a nice little, like, memory latency reduction and just general bandwidth and performance boost as well. So, like, it is one of those settings that if you can if you can turn it on, you should. If you can't, well, sucks to be you. Go complain to Intel that their memory controllers are too inconsistent. Anyway, so timings. This memory kit doesn't have particularly great TRCD. There are kits out there that'll do like TRCD 38 at 6400. This kit doesn't. This is probably the weakest kit of Hynix MDI I have in terms of TRCD. So, yeah. And you might be wondering why I'm using it, and it's just like, it was lying on my desk, so I used it. So, there. Anyway, 30, 39, 39, 28. TRAS is at 28 because the TRAS register literally doesn't go below 28, or at least according to Intel's documentation, it doesn't go below 28. Then for cast write latency, well, also, if you're noticing there's a lot of timings set to auto, that's because a lot of these timings don't actually exist on Intel CPUs. So you might be wondering why they're in the BIOS, and I have no answer to that question. I have no idea why, for example, TRC exists on the Intel BIOS when I know for a fact that Intel does not have a TRC register. The way the TRC timing is handled is just TRP and TRAS. So yeah, and like the CPU derives the TRC value from TRP and TRAS. There isn't a direct way to set the TRC. So I don't know why there's a TRC setting in the BIOS. It's also probably the reason why, the BIOS doesn't read out a timing value for the TRC right now, because there's no register for it. So yeah. Anyway, similar situation with TWR. Though the BIOS is actually doing the calculation for TWR, there's a different timing that controls that parameter. Anyway, cast write latency is at 26. A lot of Hynix memory sticks will do very low cast write latency. However, it is Silicon Lottery dependent. There are some sticks that really don't like super low cast write latency, and 26 isn't even that low. I've seen some kits go as low as like 16 sometimes. So yeah, but also it's worth noting that cast write latency doesn't affect performance that much, because it just affects write latency, and that's like for the start of a write operation. It doesn't really affect the rest of it. So anyway, below that we have our TRRDs, which are both at 4. This is as low as these go, and these do boost performance quite significantly. Like, basically, if there's sort of if there's a priority list for memory timings, TRRD and TFAW are sort of the most important timings, because these control how quickly the memory controller can open different rows. Well, open rows in different wait, no, I'm misremembering it. I shouldn't be trying to explain the memory timings right now. Screw it. It's just 4-4. That's best for performance. They don't go lower. I have videos covering what most of the memory timings do. I can't remember what. I think it's row-to-row delay. Same group. Oh, right, because you have different banks in each bank group. And then you have different bank groups. Right. Yeah, no, there's too much terminology. I stumbled over it. Anyway, either way, if you have Hynix MDI, you generally should be able to do 4-4 TRRDs at least up to like 6800 megabits per second. Well, kind of depends on the sticks. Some sticks don't like it. You might have to run like 4.6 or something. But MDI generally does do better TRRDs than ADI. Like, ADI very consistently has to have a really high TRRDL. MDI, as long as you're at lower memory speeds like 6000 to say 6600, you should almost be guaranteed that 4.4 works. So yeah, anyway, then for TRFC2, we've got 333. The TRFC timing is not used by the default memory controller configuration of Gigabyte motherboards, which is why that's set to auto. So TRFC2 is at 333. You might be able to set this slightly lower than this, but it doesn't really make that much of a performance difference. TRFC per bank is at 233. Same kind of deal. On a lot of MDI sticks, you should, like, even here, I don't think this is minimized. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if 300 and 200 was also perfectly fine. But the thing is, going from 333 to 300 doesn't make much of a performance difference. Like, with Intel CPUs, you can adjust the refresh interval, and when your refresh interval is once every 111,000 clock cycles, spending 300 clock cycles refreshing instead of 330 clock cycles refreshing really doesn't make much of a difference. Okay, like, you're refreshing so infrequently and so for such a short period of time that it just doesn't matter. So that, instead of worrying about minimizing TRFC, you just punch in a nice high TREFI, though you can set the TREFI so high that you start having memory stability issues. But like, low 100,000s generally works. If you want to be extra safe, you could be like at 65,000. 65,000 I've never seen issues with. Low 100,000s also, I've not seen any issues with it myself. I've seen a lot of other people use like 120,000, that, low 100,000 range TREFI values. And I know for sure from experience that at like 260,000, you can start having stability problems. So yeah, and 260,000 is the register limit for the timing. So yeah, well, actually, it's not even 260,000. It's even higher than that. It's like 262,143. But yeah, like, out of convenience, just pressing 1 6 times is a good TREFI value that will generally work. And then you don't have to worry about your TRFC timings that much. Though on MDI, you do have quite a lot of headroom compared to stock TRFC, because stock TRFC is almost 500 at 6400 megabits per second. So going from like 500 to 330 actually does make a decent difference. But going from like 330 to 300, not really a difference. Anyway, RTP is not a thing on Intel CPUs. TFAW is at 16. It doesn't go lower than that. Well, the motherboard won't stop you, but the way TFAW works is, well, the Intel memory controller isn't supposed to be able to run TFAW below 16. And also, your TFAW basically controls, is tied to the TRRD timings, and basically 4 times 4 is 16. You can't set it below, like, if you set it to 12, it doesn't do anything in this configuration because the TRRDs are 4/4 anyway. Anyway, command rate is set to 1T. This is just a nice general performance boost. Now, this doesn't literally double your command rate because command rate is a really misleading name for this timing. I think it's a holdover from the DDR1 days, or like early DDR memory days. Basically, and what Intel calls this the command stretch timing, which makes way more sense because this just controls how long a command, like say a read command, a write command, activate command, pre-charge command, is held on the command address bus. And with 1T, it's held for 1 clock cycle. With 2T, it's held for 2 clock cycles. But these are memory controller clock cycles, not memory clock cycles. And on Intel CPUs, if you're running DDR5, you're permanently in Gear 2 or Gear 4 even. Well, you shouldn't be in Gear 4. Don't go into Gear 4. It's bad. It's really, really bad. But if you're on DDR5, you're basically permanently in Gear 2, which means the memory controller is actually running at half the clock of the memory. So even 1T command rate ends up being 2 clock cycles of the memory clock and 1 clock cycle of the memory controller clock. And 2T command rate in Gear 2 ends up being 4 clock cycles of the memory clock. So there is quite a nice performance boost going from 2T to 1T. So if if you can do 6600 with 2T and 6400 with 1T, you go with 6400 1T. If the difference is like you can do 7200 on 2T and 6400 and like max 6400 on 1T, then you actually go with 2T and 7200. Right? So that's kind of why I opted to go with 6400 1T here. If with the Hynix A die it was 2T, though admittedly with the A die I didn't check what happens if you try to turn on 1T command rate. I just kind of assumed that at 7200 it's not going to work because the command rate the higher you push the memory speed, the less like the more problematic it becomes. But yeah, for this setup here, it makes sense to go with 1T command rate, but if you have the option to really push the memory speed high on 2T, 2T is actually better. Anyway, let's keep going. TXP, we're at 4. TRD, so TXP at 4. This generally doesn't affect stability in any way, shape, or form, and it gives you a nice little memory latency reduction. So that's just like free memory latency reduction right there. Then we get the power down enable timings. Honestly, you can just leave these on auto, in my opinion. They don't really do anything, but if you want to set them like 244, doesn't change performance. It also doesn't affect stability. Then we have read to precharge, which is Intel's like the actual register for the read to precharge timing. What's really stupid about it is that's the same thing. RTP stands for read to precharge. And then you have the Intel register read precharge, which is also read to precharge. Anyway, here you set, like on a Gigabyte motherboard, or actually any motherboard where you have the TRD pre timing, you should use TRD pre. On Asus motherboards, you actually won't see this timing in the BIOS because Asus just sort of shoves it into the RTP timing. Consistency, yay Intel. See, that's one thing you can't complain about with AMD motherboards is like AMD has very rigid control over the memory timings. So it's relatively, like, at least you don't get, like, different, like, memory timings that don't exist. Now, sometimes you don't have access to all of the timings that do exist, but at least you don't have any timings that don't exist. Anyway, TCK at 4. This doesn't cause any stability issues. It boosts performance a little bit, and there's just no reason. And it doesn't go below 4. At least it shouldn't go below 4. Yeah, no, it doesn't go below 4. Anyway, then we have a bunch of timings that don't matter. And then we get to our tertiary timings. And this is one of the places where MDI can go really, really tight. So read to read, same group, we're at 11. Read to read, different group, we're at 7. These don't go any lower. At least not at 6400, they don't go any lower. Read to write at 18. Those don't really go any lower than this either. Write to write on MDI is just insane. You can have a same group write to write of 9, which is, like, this is the only memory chip that I'm aware of that does this for DDR5. It's kind of crazy. And the really crazy thing is that the default, like, timing for write to write, same group on DDR5 is really loose. Like, you can see it over here. The default value is 34. And yeah, on a lot of Hynix and even, well, Samsung does okay-ish with write to write, but especially Hynix memory chips, like, you could just have insanely low write to write timings, which is kind of cool. Anyway, write to write different group at 7. That again doesn't go any lower than that. And then for write to read, same group, different group, I have it at 60 and 46. These might go very slightly lower, but these are about as low as they go. And also, these are two timings that it's very easy to set them slightly unstable. So, yeah, I generally prefer to err on the side of caution with these two, where they're slightly looser than they might have to be, because these cause all kinds of annoying stability problems. Oh, that reminds me. On a lot of Hynix sticks, you can also do this for your RD pre. Which is insane. Like, that's actually crazy. Or actually, Hynix MDI, you can do really low read to pre-charge. On basically any other DDR5, you can't do that because it just doesn't work. Even Hynix ADI, you need to have the read to pre-charge at like 16. Yeah, I don't think even 12 works on ADI. So, yeah, MDI is, like, if you're stuck at low memory speeds, MDI is the way to go. But with the Intel memory controller, the thing is, right, Hynix ADI is significantly more expensive. You can get good MDI memory sticks these days for like $200-ish. So I am really not sure why you'd want to, well, I don't know why you'd want to put ADI on a motherboard like this, because I don't think you'd be able to push the memory sticks to a high enough clock to justify the 50% higher price. There are definitely motherboards out there where that isn't the case, though, but I don't think this is one of them, considering how incredibly difficult it was to get 7200 to work, and I really don't think like, running MDI at anything less than 7,000 is actually, I mean, running ADI at anything less than 7,000 is just a waste of effort. Because MDI at below 7,000, MDI is actually very, very, like, you have better timings. The speed gap isn't that big. And so the performance difference is really, really small. Anyway, so yeah, those are some MDI memory settings for this motherboard. This was actually, like, surprisingly difficult to set up because, again, like, this board really seems to hate high memory voltages, and early on, like, I was kind of hoping to do like CL28 or something at 6400, which is doable if you just shove enough voltage into the VDD part of the memory chip. But the thing is, if you're raising VDD, you should also raise VDDQ, as you don't want to have too big a gap between VDDQ and VDD that may permanently damage the memory chip. Like, the documentation isn't exactly, like, super clear on, like, how bad an idea it is to have a large gap between the two voltages, but generally I wouldn't set them more than 100 millivolts apart. And so basically, if you wanted to run like VDD of 1.55 volts, which might do CL28 at 6400, you'd need like a VDDQ of 1.5, and then this stops being, like, very quickly this stops being stable. So yeah, if you have the Z790 Aorus Elite and you're tuning some Hynix M die or even A die, it really seems like the main limiting factor with this motherboard is that you really can't set the memory voltages super high because it stops being stable very quickly. So, yeah. Anyway, that's it for this video. So big thank you to Intel, Gigabyte, and Corsair for providing the hardware. Hopefully this is somewhat useful for you if you're setting up a Gigabyte 6-layer daisy chain motherboard. So there's other boards from Gigabyte that use the same memory topology. Yeah, that's it for the video. So thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon. There's a link to that down in the description below. There's also the AHOC Teespring store where you can pick up shirts, hoodies, posters, the usual YouTuber merch. There's a link to that down in the description. And I also have a solo industrial noise project on Bandcamp. So if for some reason you want to listen to that kind of thing, there's a link to that down in the description below as well. And yeah, that's it for the video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.